today, I think it centers around one question. And that question is, how will you recognize Jesus? Now, think about that for a little bit. Think about this. Because it's a great question, right? When we talk about this all the time, when we were confirmed or we did like a dedication, like when we're younger, we talk about Jesus and how we'll live a life for him. But I want you to think about this for a second. How will you recognize Jesus? We talk about him returning, but when he does, how will you know who he is? We talk about dying and being with Jesus. How will we recognize him? We say things like, if you died tonight, do you know where you would go? Would you go to the good place and with Jesus, or would you go to the bad place and be with Boo-hoo there, right? Like that's, but how will you know which place you're in? Right? Like these are all kind of questions. And I think we have the answers in our heads for them. Like we know what it looks like. We have like the picture in our minds, right? But so did the disciples. So did the disciples. And they never really seemed to get it right. They finally recognized, Jesus, we know you are the one that's come to save. But when Jesus is raised in glory on the cross, they certainly don't view it as a glorious raising. In fact, something we said in Sunday school today was their dreams of everything the Messiah was going to be also died on the cross with Jesus. Their recognizing Jesus, their ability to recognize the Messiah died with Jesus on the cross. And that's what I think is interesting about the Gospel of Luke. That's what I think is kind of interesting about this, because it's about those who recognize Jesus and those who don't. And the ones that recognize Jesus are kind of interesting. Right there at the beginning, we see John the Baptist. John the Baptist, and he's in the womb of Elizabeth. And Elizabeth and Mary, they come to visit each other. And when they go into the same room, what happens? John the Baptist in the womb recognizes Jesus in the womb of Mary and leaps, right? I've never been pregnant before. Right? But he leaps in the womb, right? That's what he does. And Elizabeth's like, whoa. After Jesus is born, think about the whole Christmas story. It's all these people that are recognizing Jesus. Shepherds coming in from the fields recognize him. Dirty shepherds, right? They come and they recognize Jesus. There's this old man named Simeon who's been working in the temple for years and years and years. And he was promised that he would be able to see the Messiah before he dies. And I just think about that. He's like, God, time's running out, if this is going to happen. And then he sees Mary and Joseph carrying the young boy, and he takes the boy in his hands and he says, my eyes have seen your glory. He recognizes him. A woman facing medical distress where she's bleeding and can't stop. She recognizes Jesus and does everything in her power to push through the crowds and reaches out and touches the hem of his garment to recognize him. It's Jesus spits in mud, rubs it in a blind man's eyes, and he sees. There's been multiple times when blind men receive their sights and they praise and worship God there, right? And Luke is saying to us all, he's like, the disciples aren't seeing, the chief priests aren't seeing, everyone that should be seeing and recognizing Jesus doesn't, but this blind man sees. Do you see? Do you recognize him? That's kind of what it does. And then we start seeing like a pattern emerge in Luke about how we recognize Jesus. And this is kind of funny. And I don't know. I would like to have this same kind of idea said about me, but you recognize Jesus because of where the food is, right? He's always around food, right? Like think about it, like the feeding of the 5,000. You know, they recognize Jesus there when he took 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? And they had this great banquet meal. And at the end of the story almost, you know, we celebrate this on oh no, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead. We have then you have like right before Jesus goes into Jerusalem, there's this story about this wee little man named Zacchaeus, right? And he was a dirty, nasty tax collector, but he was short of stature. And so he wanted to see who this Jesus is. And it's almost like Zacchaeus, this terrible, sinful, no good tax collector, and he had to climb a tree because he recognized Jesus. And he's in that tree, Jesus goes, I'm going to go over to your house and eat tonight, Zacchaeus. And all the chief priests and all that stuff clutch their pearls and go, what? He should be eating with me. I've been fasting and being righteous for the last 30 years, right? He should be with me, not going and eating with the short tax collector who just debased himself by climbing a sycamore tree, right? And when he's in there, he eats with Zacchaeus, and Zacchaeus recognizes Jesus fully, and he gives away everything that he has. And he says, to anyone I've cheated, I will give even more back. And Jesus says, today salvation has come to this house. And then Jesus says, because I have come to seek and save that which was lost. But think about those parables of the lost things. You have the lady who lost her coin. You have the guy who lost his sheep. And you have the man who lost his son. Well, his son kind of was like, Dad, I'll see you later. And he walked away, right? Like they have all these things that are lost. And what do they do when they find all the lost things? Like the woman finds her lost coin and goes, let's spend 3 times this coin and throw the best feast party thing that's ever existed, right? The guy loses his sheep and he's like, I found my lost sheep. Let's all have a party and have a huge feast. The man finds his lost son and he throws this huge feast. You notice anything similar there? It's always around food. It's always around food. People are always doing things around food when they celebrate it. And I think you begin to recognize Jesus when you get around food. And I think when we celebrate Maundy Thursday last week, when we celebrate the Lord's Supper, I think that's intentional. That we recognize Jesus around that food, around what was then that Passover meal, but means so much more to us now, where in that meal we take the very suffering, death, blood, all of that of Jesus. We take that on ourselves as we take his very salvation onto us. Yet after that meal, the disciples are like, what? I don't get it, Jesus. I don't get it. Like, what do you mean one of us is going to betray you and all that stuff? We'd never do that, Jesus. And Peter, like 5 hours later, is like, no, I don't know who that is. I don't know who that is, right? Like that's like the story just plays out. They don't recognize it. They think they know what Jesus is, but they just don't recognize it. So again, I ask that question. How will you recognize Jesus? How will you recognize him? Like, I think that's an important question. Because like when I was growing up, I knew exactly what Jesus was going to look like. I knew exactly what Jesus was going to do, who he was going to be. And now, I don't know. Because sometimes I feel like Peter and the disciples, and it's like, I really don't know what you're doing, Jesus, right? Like that's, how will you recognize him? Do we look for Jesus in places where he's not sometimes? And this is where I start using language like, do we look for Jesus? Like I said in the confession, like I said, do we look for him in the chaff? Do we look for him in the disembodied states? Do we look for him in the shallow stuff? Do we look for him in the stuff that doesn't last? You know, sometimes we make Jesus into he's just like our spiritual guru or cheerleader that's like, you can do it, yay, you know, like all that. And we trying to get through the day and get all those things that, you know, do we make Jesus into this disembodied spiritual idea of salvation, where the only reason why Jesus existed, did anything at all, is that so that I can find salvation, so that I can be a deity, so that I can be the God of my own universe. Like, is that why Jesus did all that? You know, how will we recognize Jesus? There's these two guys walking on the road to Emmaus. Well, it could have been a guy and a lady. We don't know who the second person is. I think it's two guys, though. You know why I think it's two guys? If you were at the Thursday Bible study, you would already know this. So you should come to the Thursday Bible study because Glenn was there. Glenn's not here today. I will say that. But Glenn was there, and he was spitting out some good questions and all that stuff like that. But I think it was two guys walking to Emmaus, and it wasn't a guy and a woman. You know why? Because all the women seem to know what's going on at the end of Luke. like all the women are seeing Jesus, and they're believing that he's raised from the dead, and they come back and they tell all the guys, and the guys are like, I don't know. You guys like to tell your stories, you know? That's solely the reason why. But these two guys are walking down the road, and Jesus just comes up right next to them and starts talking to them. Now, how embarrassing is that? These people have been following Jesus most likely for years, right? And all of a sudden, he's sitting right next to him, talking to him, and they're just like, no, I don't know who it is. That's why I asked that question. Will we recognize him? And he's like, what you guys talking about? And they're like, dude, don't you know what has happened in the last couple of days? Don't you know what's been going on? He tells them this. He goes, oh, foolish ones, listen. When you read the Bible, you need to understand it's cleaned up a little bit. You know, oh, foolish ones, who talks like that? Nobody. Do you go, when someone really messes up your order at a restaurant, and it's obvious, do you go, oh, foolish one? Point taken, right? Like that's, or like when your kids are doing something, and you're just like, oh, foolish one. No, it's when someone mows over all your flowers, you don't come out, oh, foolish one, right? You come out shooting with all kinds of words that I can't say unless I want to be fired, right? Picture that. You idiot, right? You slow of heart to believe all the prophets have spoken. Like, what's he saying? He's like, why aren't you recognizing what's going on? Was it not necessary for Christ to suffer these things and enter into his glory? And then beginning with Moses and the prophets, he explained everything to them. He explained all these things concerning himself. Jesus teaches them about everything, about how the Red Sea was connected, how Egypt was connected, how the Exodus story is actually a Christmas story from, remember, 2 years ago? Like all these things in the beginning, he talked about all these things and connected them. And here's the thing. If we were telling this story today, new, we would say, that's when their like third eye opened up and they understood the world, and they're like, Jesus, we finally see your truth. You finally explained it to us. But what does the Bible say? He says that they were still drooling. It didn't say that specifically, but they're still drooling out of their mouth. They're like, all right, that's cool. Well, we see that you want to go walk, but we've got some dinner. You want to eat some dinner with us? And he's like, sure. Like, they still don't recognize him. Even after he says, look at all this. It's true, they still don't recognize him. And so he eats with them, and he says, when he was at the table with them, he took the bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them, and then their eyes were opened. That's what I love. It's because it seems to me, and like I struggle with this too, like I believe oftentimes that I can convince you of anything if I can just tell you the right things about it, right? Like I can convince you that you should go out and buy this product if I can just get it to you, right? Like convince you. I can convince my neighbor to believe in Jesus if I can just have the perfect argument, right? Like if I can just do this, we believe in the perfect argument. Jesus gave the perfect argument, but they recognized it when he broke the bread like he broke it with the 5,000. When he broke the bread like he broke it on the Maundy Thursday. When he broke the bread and they remembered the sacrifice and all of that, when they physically took part in something with Jesus, suddenly they remember. Suddenly they recognize him. Suddenly that thing where that taste, touch, feel thing, they suddenly recognize who he is. They're being dense the whole time, but suddenly Jesus does something physical with them, and their eyes are opened and they see him. So, how will you recognize Jesus? How will you recognize him? Because all of that happened 2,000 years ago, right? All that. After that story, he walks in and all of a sudden he just appears to his disciples. He disappears from that Road to Emmaus group, appears to the disciples. He's like, hey guys. And they're like, ah. And he's like, no, peace. I leave with you. Like, peace, I'm here. And they're scared and they think he's a ghost. Just like many of us think he's a ghost. And he's like, nah, guys, listen. Touch my hands. Touch my feet. Why is he having them touch his hands and feet? Because that's where the holes were, right? Like, touch my hands, touch my feet. And then he goes this. Remember when we were talking about food earlier? He says, you guys have anything to eat? I'm a little hungry. And they recognize him. And they're like, those women were right. The whole time. He's alive and he's actually here physically with them. He actually is physically there. So how will you recognize Jesus? How will you recognize him? So often, I think we want Jesus to have this disembodied spiritual thing with us because that's clean. Right? We want our faith to be nice and clean. You know, I want to know where everything is. I want it to be all organized. I want to do it. But here's the thing. Moms, dads who's been in the room when your children are born, is it clean? No, not at all, right? Not at all. Yet that's how Jesus came into the world. He came into the world in the physical mess of a birth. And you know how Jesus works today? He works today in the physical mess of the body of Christ, this church. And this place is a mess. Have you seen you guys recently? Like, we're all a mess, right? Like that's over there. And yet that is how Jesus works. Like so often we think like, man, if Jesus could just make this happen. Well, he does. And it happens through us. It happens through here. It happens when you sit next to someone, put your hand on their shoulder and go, I am with you, right? And that person then may recognize Jesus, knows that Jesus is there with him. We want this to be nice and clean, but it's always a mess. Remember what I talked about eating with Jesus? Now, after you have a big family meal, that's like Thanksgiving or Christmas, or we just had Easter, and you have the big family meal, is the table nice and clean? Come on. Is the table nice and clean? No, it's a mess. You got to clean it up. We have dedicated machines at least most of us, have dedicated machines in their homes completely devoted to cleaning up that mess. Right? And that's the mess where the people realized that it was Jesus. And that's what I think Luke wants us to see. Is that we so often are like the disciples. We want Jesus to have this clean salvation somewhere up in the clouds where someday we'll be able to ascend out of our physical bodies and be up like the Care Bears up in the clouds shooting rainbows out of our belly buttons. That's for the millennials. Do you guys remember Care Bears if you're not a millennial? They shot rainbows out of their belly buttons, didn't they? Like we think that that's what Jesus is, but Jesus comes down to here into the mess of the everyday life, into the mess of our life that he showed us his birth, in the mess of our everyday life here as the church, as we're going to see in Acts. And he comes in and works in the mess of his meal, in the meal with us. Jesus comes in and redeems the mess, enjoys it, and says, I am here with you. And I think that's what Luke wants us to see. He wants us to see that Jesus gave us the sacraments. And what is a sacrament? Do you guys remember what a sacrament is? All right, let's go back to confirmation. Sacrament. It's when something spiritual is connected to something physical, right? So the spiritual and the physical are connecting there. And when you think of physical, that's oftentimes something messy, right? Well, God connects himself to the messy physical things to bring about salvation to us all. Think about baptism. Physical, messy thing. We sure clean it up. We got like white and, we do it all of that, but physical, messy thing, which brings us salvation. Physical, messy thing. Especially, you guys heard about the story with Kevin, right? I think we told this already. But Kevin was really upset at somebody. It wasn't me at all, who sometimes spills wine down here. And he cleaned it up and he made a big deal. He's like, isn't this nice and clean up here? That Sunday after he cleaned it, he spilt wine on the floor. But I think that's in line with what Jesus wants. That he comes into the mess of all of our lives so that we all may know that we can rest in him, that he brings us life and salvation no matter how dirty we are. And I think that's good news. And we'll end right there.